Welcome to California State University Chico's online field instructor orientation. You are beginning Module 2. The learning objectives for Module 2 will include understanding the importance of the agency orientation, becoming familiar with the elements of a successful agency orientation, and finally to identify strategies to incorporate these elements into your supervision. A student's first few days in an agency can set the tone for the placement. When they arrive for their first day of their placement and they're greeted warmly by office staff, they know that a good deal of preparation has gone into preparing the staff and the agency as a whole for their field practicum. A formal orientation can really help mediate a student's anxiety. They're typically anxious about their performance, meeting new colleagues, what will be expected of them from the agency. So having a formal structure that's laid out in terms of how they'll be introduced to staff and how they'll be introduced to the various learning activities that will be a part of their field practicum can go a long way towards mediating that anxiety. Students also spend less time learning when they have to spend their time finding basic information out on their own. So when they're provided an orientation that will give them some very helpful basic information about the agency, they can focus more on the learning activities that will really contribute to their professional development. Students who participate in activities designed to orient them to the agency report that these activities really do enhance their field experience. Also, students who find the agency orientation helpful are more likely to believe that their field instructor is also helpful. The majority of students who are given reading materials about their agency in the beginning of the placement report that these materials really enhanced their learning experience. These reading materials might include articles that describe the practice model used in the agency. It may be information about the population that's being served by the agency, or it may also be information about legislation that impacts the services or laws that dictate the services offered. Students who have a positive initial impression of their field agency have higher levels of overall satisfaction upon completion of their field placement. Prior to the arrival of your student, there are a few things you may want to consider coordinating. Having a designated physical space where the student will be located is often an important piece of the student being welcomed. A place where they can put their personal belongings will make them feel like they are more a part of the agency. Communicating to other staff members the role and the purpose of the student is also an important piece to take care of prior to the arrival of your student. There may be some discussion that goes on amongst staff members about the role of the student and activities they may feel are relevant for the student to participate in. So having that discussion ahead of time is really helpful. Also, checking with your human resource department to determine if there is any paperwork the student may need to complete prior to their arrival. It can be mileage reimbursement forms. Perhaps there's a live scan that's required for students to volunteer in your agency, or a TB test. The sooner you find out about the kinds of things that may be required of your student, the more likely it is that those things can be taken care of and the student will be allowed to start their placement in a timely manner. As you begin to think about what to include in the orientation, consider it from the perspective of the 5 W's. What? What needs to be included in an orientation? And thinking about it from the perspective of a new employee is often helpful. Talking with fairly recent employees to the agency may be a great way to gather some orientation information and ideas about what to include. Consider who should be responsible for each of those orientation activities. And field instructors are highly encouraged to disperse that responsibility amongst several staff members in the agency. Finally, where? Where does the student need to go to find that person, or in order for them to attend a particular meeting, ensuring that they have the date, the time, the location, and any material that they should have reviewed prior to that meeting is also good information for them to have. When an activity should be completed is also an important piece to communicate to a student about their orientation. So if there's an expectation that they will review the agency policy manual, when would you like that task completed by? And finally, why? Talking to students about the relevance of each task that you assign them in terms of their orientation is a critical piece for students to help them understand the significance of the information they're reading, of the meeting they're attending, or of the person that they are meeting. When the student arrives, you want to be sure that you have informed your front office staff so that they can plan to greet this student. Also, setting aside time to provide the student with a physical tour of the agency on that first day is also very helpful. And finally, introducing students to important staff members that they'll likely be interacting with during their placement is also a way to get this placement off to a good start. Scheduling brief meet and greet presentations with key staff agency can also be very helpful in terms of helping a student get the overall organizational structure of your agency. So perhaps a brief meeting with your personnel director. Perhaps another meeting with your agency director or specific program managers that they may be interacting with. And finally, administrative support staff are often very critical to students during their field practicum. Where do they go to make copies? Is there certain identification they need in order to make that copy? Where can they go to use a particular phone or computer? Having each of these staff members describe their role in the agency and circumstances that might require the student to consult with them on is information that will be helpful to your student. Consider developing an orientation packet. And it may be that your agency already has a new employee packet and those materials might as well be helpful to a student. But any written materials that will help a student learn about the agency's mission, services, and the population served are very critical. Agency policies or procedures that the student will need to demonstrate familiarity with, knowing where they can locate those agency policies and procedures is helpful. And finally, selected readings. If you have specific readings that you believe are very helpful in terms of the student understanding more about the population being served or the issues being addressed by the population you're working with, don't be shy about assigning students those readings. There may be some specific information that you will want to include in your orientation. Having a discussion about the agency dress code is a very important part of an agency orientation, letting students know what's appropriate attire in the agency and what is not appropriate. Parking information. If a student is driving their vehicle to your agency every day, where is it acceptable for them to park? A glossary of agency terminology used. There's specific acronyms for the programs you have in your agency or acronyms you use for other agencies that you work with, ensuring that the student understands what those acronym means and other terminology is helpful. Hours of work and any overtime policy that you may have in regard to that. Even though your student is a volunteer in that agency, we expect that they will be socialized to the specific hours of your agency. So what time are they expected to show up? What time does the day end? If they're in situations where they are working longer than those hours, what accommodations will you make in their hours for that week? We prefer that students work closely to the 16-hour or the 24-hour schedule per week. Ideally, students are going to start their placement at the beginning of the semester and complete hours all the way through the end of the academic year. On occasion, we've had students who have been in practicums where they have accumulated extra hours week after week after week and are then wanting to end their placement prior to the end of the academic year. We discourage this and really encourage you to try to monitor your students' hours so that they meet with the 16-hour or the 24-hour week requirement fairly consistently. If there are specific meetings that you are asking the student to attend on a weekly or monthly basis, ensuring that they have the times and dates of those meetings and locations is important. Policies regarding transportation of clients. The School of Social Work prefers that students do not transport clients in their personal vehicles, and it's important to note that the university's liability coverage does not extend to the student's personal vehicle. If you are going to ask students to transport clients, we would prefer that you have students do that with an agency car. If you ask students to use their personal vehicle, you may want to ask them for a copy of their DMV record and also verify that they have insurance. If you are requiring a student to use their personal vehicle to complete home visits, we strongly encourage agencies to consider reimbursing students for those miles. And finally, while the School of Social Work has emergency contact for each student, you may want to also gather that emergency contact information from your student. Another important part of an agency orientation is a comprehensive agency description. So providing students with information about the clientele served, including eligibility requirements for services, the types of services provided, and also services that are not provided. Talking at length with the student about what the role of the social worker in your agency is, providing an overview of the organizational structure of your agency, and finally, any procedure that is in place for making referrals. It's important also to discuss with your student how they will identify themselves to clients or consumers that they're working with. It's important to develop a title that your student can use and that accurately really reflects their role. It should always be clear to a client or a consumer that the student is practicing under your supervision. Having the student role play an introduction with the client is often a helpful way of getting them more comfortable with introducing themselves to clients. My name is Jane. I'm a student intern here at the agency. I'm working on my degree in social work, and I'll be completing a practicum during the academic year. My work is supervised by an agency field instructor. I do discuss and process the work that I'm doing with that person. Helping the student really get oriented and clear about how they'll have that conversation with clients and consumers that they're working with is really important. Confidentiality is another area that we recommend be included in the agency orientation, providing specific information for your student about your agency's policy around confidentiality and potential disclosures of confidential information. Students are introduced to the concept of confidentiality in the classroom. They're familiar with HIPAA. However, each agency really should have their student participate in the same HIPAA training that's provided to any new employee. Safety is another area that we highly encourage you to discuss with your student early on in the internship. It's important to discuss with students safety precautions that are applicable to the work that they'll be involved in providing in your agency. For example, if home visits or work in the field is required of the student, be sure to discuss the protocol for a student notifying agency staff of their whereabouts, or their cell phones, or other measures that they need to take with them. If there is information about specific neighborhoods that is important for a student to know, or driving directions, how do they gas up an agency vehicle, those kinds of pieces are all really critical information for a student to have before they're required to go out in the field. If they find themselves in a situation where there are some red flags appearing, they're uncomfortable, they're concerned about their safety, really role-playing with them what they would do in that situation, what they might say, and precautions they would need to take in order to remove themselves from the situation. Again, I just want to emphasize that we do not cover students for driving their personal vehicles. So if they're required to drive their personal vehicle to do a home visit, something happens in the course of that visit, their personal insurance would be responsible for addressing any damage that was done to their vehicle. Keep in mind as well that if a student is involved in an accident or something happens to them while they're in their field practicum, we ideally like to have the student receive services at the student health center on campus. If the situation is such that the student cannot access the health center, then they are certainly free to go to an emergency room to get adequate care. There are accident forms that will be accessible on our website that the student will need to fill out in conjunction with their faculty field liaison and also their agency field instructor. The supervisory relationship is really a critical aspect of a student's field practicum, and there are some issues that are best discussed early on in the internship that will help prepare the student for supervision. Specifically, talking with your student a little bit about your supervisory style is very helpful for the student, and in turn asking the student to talk with you about their learning style. If you have a student who is a visual learner and your supervisory style tends to be assigning a task and having the student go try it right away and then coming back to discuss it, you may need to discuss some ways to bridge the gap between that learning style and the supervisory style. If you have a student who prefers to observe someone else doing the task that's been assigned first before they try to perform the task themselves, again, you may want to discuss some ways to bridge that gap. Also talking about guidelines for your availability. If you are not in the agency on the days that your student is there on a consistent basis, who else can the student consult with if they have questions or concerns that come up? And finally, providing the student with an overview of how the placement will develop over the course of the year is an important part of that supervisory discussion. So if your plan is to have the student shadow other members of the staff for a period of time, then begin co-carrying a case with a particular staff member, and eventually looking towards, in the second semester, having the student have more autonomy and more responsibility for a small caseload, it's helpful to share that vision with your student. Take a moment to really think about what strategies you want to use to develop an effective agency orientation. As I mentioned before, you may want to consult with new employees who have recently joined your staff and ask for suggestions from them about what's been helpful to them in terms of orienting them to the population being served, to agencies, procedures. There's handouts available on our website under Agency Field Instructor Resources that provide you specific details about effective agency orientations. We also have an ethical guidelines form that students will bring to you, and it will outline some very specific pieces that the school asks you to review in an orientation with your student. We hope that this module has helped you understand more about why an agency orientation is important, the critical elements to be included in an effective agency orientation, and strategies for developing an effective agency orientation.